My name's Courtney, and it really is my pleasure to introduce our next conversation about the work that local funders are doing to address community needs with journalism. So, from hunger, education, climate justice, there are so many important critical needs that require philanthropic support, really in any community. And news shapes how we understand these problems, how we perceive the people that are impacted by them. News helps to shed light on potential solutions that are working. And because of this, some funders recognize journalism as an essential part of the fabric of building thriving and equitable communities. And so during this next session, you'll hear from local funders who see journalism in this way. With that said, I'd like to welcome Karen Runlet, Director of Journalism at the Knight Foundation. Knight Foundation is a primary sponsor of INN Days along with Inasmuch Foundation, and we are so grateful for their participation in this panel. Karen will be leading the conversation with Lolly Bowen from Field Foundation and Melissa Davis from Gates Family Foundation. And we are so thankful that they are joining us today. Karen, I will let you take it from here.
Thanks so much, Courtney. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I just wanted to start by saying congrats to INN for really putting together such a forward-looking and inclusive program for us. You know, last year in the early part of the pandemic, the staff at Knight was discussing signals and trends that we were hearing and seeing with our grantees. And, you know, Knight also funds the arts, and we also fund a lot of work around public spaces. And at that time, increasingly, we were hearing people ask what role government should play in supporting local news. So it's just interesting to see that more than a year later, those questions are such a huge part of this program. Anyway, right now, this session is about local philanthropy. And, you know, Courtney did a great introduction of Lolly and Melissa. So I'd just like to start by asking Lolly, what do you fund at the Field Foundation?
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you for this opportunity to be here at INN Days. So the Field Foundation is a racial justice foundation based in Chicago, and in 2019, the foundation started an independent media and storytelling portfolio. Just to give people a little bit of background, Field Foundation has long supported journalism and media and storytelling, and the Field family actually were investors in the Chicago Sun-Times and are partially responsible for the starting of that, one of the daily newspapers here. So there's a long history there. But in 2019, there was some research conducted by Susan Smith Richardson that examined the communities of Chicago, the coverage here, and who was getting funding. And what we found is that communities of color, in particular, low-income communities on the south and west sides of Chicago, were being shortchanged in the type of coverage that they were getting by the mainstream and dominant news narrative. So one, we found, or Field found through its research, that there were news deserts and that critical and important information that residents needed in order to make decisions for their lives and to be civically engaged daily was not being provided. But then secondly, and I think most importantly, that study found that there was a $60 million shortfall to media organizations that were either led by or targeted BIPOC residents, Black, Native American, Latino, and other, what we call Alana at Field, but essentially communities of color. Those communities were being served by media efforts, podcasts, newspapers, radio broadcasts, legacy media, but those media outlets were not being supported in the way that some of their mainstream dominant, i.e. white organizations were. And so the portfolio was kind of born out of that report. And so what we fund, to get to your core question, is we fund news organizations primarily that target and serve communities of color in Chicago, and that really either are embedded or are focused on communities that have been historically overlooked by mainstream media and by philanthropy. So when we say media, we're looking at news organizations, whether that's a traditional newspaper, news radio, or a digital newspaper. And when we talk about storytelling, then we're talking about fact-based documentaries, podcasts, other types of storytelling efforts that also deliver important and vital information for, by, and about these communities.
Excellent, thank you. Melissa Davis of the Gates Family Foundation, not Bill and Melinda in Denver. Please tell us what you fund.
Yeah, thanks, Karen, and thanks to Sue and her team for inviting us to talk about this. Gates Family Foundation is a place-based foundation. We do philanthropic giving throughout the state, and we're pretty broad. I think we're like a lot of funders. We don't just fund journalism, and we haven't funded journalism. It's not a huge portion of our portfolio. Primarily, we fund equitable education, natural resources, and vibrant communities. So why what we fund in at Gates is related to that informing communities, and kind of related to it's less centered in journalism and more around informing communities and engaging communities. So we have been supporting journalism, mainly public media, for about 50 years. Really, the big public media outlets in the state. About 10 to 15 years ago, as we started seeing a decline in the local news coverage and the depth and the issues that we care about, equitable education, natural resources, vibrant communities, we started doing a lot of funding of nonprofit media, and actually helped start up a few of the nonprofit newsrooms in our state to kind of fill those news gaps. And then just about 3 years ago, there was a kind of pivotal moment in our state where the journalists from the Denver Post kind of spoke out about their hedge fund owners, and really called on the community to do more and to take a look at the industry and what was going on. I think before that, people didn't really know that there was anything to do on a broader scale. And I think that really focused our attention from the philanthropic space. We did a grant to the Denver University of Denver to do some research and kind of scope the problem for us, and kind of educate all of us about what are the news needs of the state. We did a big statewide survey of over 2,000 Coloradans to get a finger on the pulse there. We did some deep listening and kind of community engagement work. And then from there, we really realized that this was a much bigger problem. It wasn't a silver bullet solution. You couldn't just spin up one statewide outlet and kind of serve all needs. And so we really decided at Gates that we wanted to double down. We kept the media project going and devoted just over $1 million for 3 years, which is big for us. We had to carve it off of all of our other giving areas and really make the case to our board that this was an issue that was pretty urgent. There was, just news gaps and news deserts forming before our eyes, and that we really needed some community and philanthropic attention on this. And so we've been kind of at that work for the last 3 years, and really trying to take an ecosystem approach to working with both the industry, but also really spurring innovation so that the industry is working more closely with communities to solve the problems of information gaps in local news.
Thanks, Melissa. Part of the reason we put this panel together, all three of us discussed it, is that philanthropy for a lot of grantees really feels mysterious. And there is a science to it. There's a bit of art to it as well. Lolly, one of the things is that founders are always talking about strategy. What does that even mean, and how does it affect your decision making and how dollars are awarded?
Thank you, Karen. Well, again, a Field Foundation is really sensitive. We are posing ourselves as a racial justice foundation, and really deeply interested in social justice and racial justice and equity. And so when you talk about impact, when we talk about results, when we talk about strategy, it is all independently viewed based on those organizations. So we're very sensitive to understand that different organizations are going to have a different sort of strategy and approach to delivering information to the community and even delivering information to us as a foundation. And so we're sensitive to that in our review process, in our outreach process, to make sure that we're not imposing sort of our standards on these news media organizations or these storytelling groups, because again, we want to be sensitive to the fact that they are serving populations that sometimes get their news in alternate ways or in alternative ways. For example, what I'm thinking about specifically is an organization that we have recruited, did outreach to, that serves a Native population here in Chicago. This particular organization has found that it is easier for them to be able to deliver news directly to their community, not just by publishing it on their own website and publishing it digitally, but by being able to share it through email newsletters and directly through social media channels, right? So their strategy for reaching their community, we have found works. And they are able to reach their community and reach their audience in a way that mainstream media just cannot, because they're just not as plugged in, grassroots, or on the ground. And so when we see their results, we register it differently based on the news organization. I hope that makes sense. So that's one when we talk about the strategy of organizations that are doing outreach to the community and how we weigh and measure that. Now, when they come to us related to their strategies for example, how they're going to fund their work, how they're going to raise money, how they're going to again, sort of supplement their budgets or essentially pay for how they're going to do their work, we're also very sensitive to those strategies too, right? So we understand that, for example, minority-owned newspapers have found a way of generating revenue that differs from that mainstream strategy. So, for example, we are partners with the Chicago Defender. We recognize that the Chicago Defender, as a part of their revenue building strategy, is to do public events and public facing events, which they were ahead of the curve because they were doing that long before the mainstream media was, right? And so when we're evaluating, for example, how stable these organizations are, we're making sure that we try to look at it through a dimensional lens. I hope that makes sense. So we're not just looking at it through this sort of traditional, how much advertising revenue are you bringing in, right? Or how many subscribers do you have? We're looking at how are you actually reaching your audience, because many times your audience can't pay for a subscription. So are you giving this information to them for free? Are you getting it to them in a way that they are able to receive it? And then how are you supporting yourself in alternate ways that doesn't necessarily look like the same ways that the mainstream media is able to generate revenue? I hope that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Melissa, look, I want to turn to you, and I just want to invite people right away. We have until 2:00 to put your questions in the chat, because this is really about, this is an AMA with 2 place-based funders. I mean, if you have a stack of applications on your desk, if you will, it's probably all digital. So, how do you really determine who gets funded, who doesn't? What are the kinds of factors that really, it is competitive. What are the kinds of factors that really edge an application out?
Yeah, so this is interesting. We kind of have 2 different answers to that. One is through the Gates Family Foundation. We actually leave a lot of the decision-making about what our portfolio managers actually decide in their issue areas, what they want to fund. Like, for example, our education program officers decide, that Chalkbeat is, the most effective, outlet in the state, and that's where they want to put their strategic dollars. So I think it's a different answer for, the issue-based the issue-based portfolios for the type of funding that I'm doing through the Colorado Media Project. We have a specific Informed Communities Fund that we pool funds from other funders that is very similar to what Lolly just described about the priorities of news outlets that are serving diverse communities, communities of color in particular. And so we've had 2 grant rounds through that Informed Communities grant opportunity. So like Lolly said, I mean, we're really looking not necessarily for how many, the numbers, but more the depth of the connection between the news outlet and the community. Are they a trusted source? A good example of this is our last grant opportunity was for vaccine reporting on the vaccine. Communities of color have some very distinct questions about the vaccine and some very real skepticism and hesitancy. And so our news outlets able to do journalism and report on those questions with authenticity and answer them in the way that those communities deserve to have answers. And so, anyway, that's kind of 2 answers. And then I'd say kind of more broadly outside of the Informed Communities Fund, we're really focused at the Media Project on sustainability. And so, we participate in, we're a local funder. We'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow, but with the NewsMatch, we have kind of a local version or a state level version of that. And for that, we're really looking for locally owned, small, more community-based outlets. And so we have a number of different grant opportunities that we really target the funding to, the objectives that the foundation or that the Media Project and our other funders are trying to accomplish.
Melissa, there's a question in there. It actually went to Lolly about supporting rural news outlets. And actually, just recently, Gates Family Foundation partnered with the National Trust for Local News and did something very, very different. Would you explain what that was?
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, this is a new, opportunity, I think, for the funders out there. We basically guaranteed a loan to the National Trust for Local News, which is a nonprofit itself that is just started a strategy of acquiring local news outlets, hyper-local news outlets in particular, trying to address the issue of encroaching news deserts or hedge funds or big national conglomerates taking over local news, the effort to keep local news local. And the role that Gates Family Foundation played, and also the Colorado Trust and American Journalism Project joined us as well. We backed, basically used our balance sheets to back a loan to purchase those and keep them locally owned. So I would just say, to funders out there who are concerned about this, sometimes in some communities, the brands are going to be all that remains. These news outlets might stay the same. They might look completely different. But a lot of these brands that are kind of up for grabs right now are, they've been in communities for many years and they still have value in their own ways. Some of them are also still profitable. So, but yeah, that's, I think, another interesting way that funders can support local news. Oh, you're on mute.
Lolly, I have a question here. I put a big unmute sign on my computer. Clearly, I'm not reading my own publication. Anyway, just a question here is, would I be correct that Lolly is making decisions based on audience connection, traffic, existing budget, subject or beat? How do funders determine audience loyalty and trust? And I think that gets to the question of impact and metrics.
Yeah, and I think it's measured kind of differently based on the news organization and the foundation itself. In Chicago, we are on the ground. When I say we, I'm talking about Field. So Field is on the ground. We're very grassroots, and I think that we are pretty plugged in, either through ourselves as the portfolio manager, I'm plugged in, but even through community organizations. So we're listening to these organizations and observing who are they turning to for their news, right? Who are the activists? Who are the people that they serve? Where are they turning in for information? How are they finding out about things that are going on? And so that's one way that we're able to find out, one, again, who's serving the community and how that community is being served. So again, it doesn't always end up being subscriptions. Sometimes it's about, well, what articles are being shared? What's being emailed around, what's being passed around, and how is this information, even that starts out from the grassroots, how is it then being elevated and penetrated to the top? One of our grantee partners here is Black Club Chicago, which is a very hyper local, on the ground, grassroots digital news operation. And they do community news. And it's, again, very hyper local from a neighborhood level. Last year, during the uprisings, one of the stories that they did was about a man who was riding a horse. He called himself the Dreadhead Cowboy. And his real name was Adam Hollingsworth. And he was riding this cowboy to various communities and just trying to use himself and his brand to uplift the neighborhoods, particularly neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago. They did this story first, kind of identifying him and giving his backstory and his history with horses. The next thing we saw is that that story got duplicated and picked up by WBEZ, which is our public radio station. It got picked up by the Chicago Tribune, which is the largest print publication in Chicago, the Chicago Sun-Times. Then it got picked up by the New York Times. So this becomes one of the ways that we're seeing the investment that we made on a very grassroots, very local, free news digital operation, and how it continues to make an impact in the entire media ecosystem, right? And so residents that initially got that news from Black Club Chicago were able to get it through their email newsletter, directly in their inbox, or through their website for free, or they saw it on social media. So again, the way that we're weighing these journalism organizations and their impact, it varies from news organization to news organization. We're on the ground, we're listening, we're watching, and we're seeing the stories kind of flourish from the ground, from the podcast, and go all the way up to the mainstream media.
Excellent. Melissa, I am getting a question about boards. I know at night, we very much answer to our board. Our board asks really thorough questions about how we're using the Knight Brothers money to support journalism. What is it? What does that mean? And how long does it take when you're working with a board?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think there is a learning curve, not just at the board level, but even at the foundation staff level. We're figuring out how to make that case, and really, like at Gates, I think it was a bit easier because we've been funding journalism, and all of our portfolio managers have, made the case that, they're having informed communities about specific topics is important at all those levels. But, when we went to our board, I think the urgency of the moment is a big, I don't want to say selling point, but they saw that, in their own lives that, the fragmentation of the media, misinformation, the impact of social media, it's like they see the degradation of the quality broadly. And so they feel like this is becoming a really important social issue, just the issue that's going on with the decline of local media, the traditional forms of local media. So, but yeah, I mean, the latitude that we have is really determined at the end of the day by the board priorities, the way that we fit the strategies into the broader board priorities. We're currently going through, we do this strategic planning process every 5 years at Gates. And, we spend a whole year. I mean, Karen, we did one-on-one talks and surveys with you guys. And, we're really talking to thought leaders in the field. We're talking to our constituents. We're talking to journalists. We're talking to our grantees to set the strategy. And so we do our best to do model community listening as we're setting strategy. But ultimately, those recommendations go to the board. And, I'm but a staff member. So the boards are really important. And I think that foundation boards, even family foundation boards, are thinking about this in different ways, hopefully moving forward.
Excellent. So a lot of comments here about the National Trust for Local News, which is still fairly new in terms of it being announced. I think you are both in large cities with significant media ecosystems, but I think this conversation is really showing us for organizations led by people of color and for organizations in rural communities where those are oftentimes, those publishers feel as though they're funding deserts. For them, and we're looking at some new opportunities. So I wanted to kind of lift that as well. And I just wanted to mention too, the Wichita Community Foundation just did some pretty serious investment in local news in Philadelphia. The Lenfest Institute, which I'm sure you know about, has invested in local news. And I will say just quickly for Knight. Knight wants to grow the pie too. And so Knight really does make an effort. And both these ladies do make an effort to speak to other funders about growing the pie. Lolly, I don't want this to end without your talking about how Field Foundation supports individuals.
Thank you. So the way that we're able to support individuals is, well, there's actually a couple ways. We actually just, Field just announced its Leaders for a New Chicago. And so there's a really unique opportunity that Field has where we identify Chicagoans that are in activism, that are in arts, and that are in media and storytelling. And we're able to give them modest grants that help to elevate their work, to promote their work. And a part of that grant also goes to the organizations that they've either built or serve in some capacity. But we are also able to give some support to storytellers that are filmmakers, documentary filmmakers that are sometimes involved in podcasts and delivering news in that way. And so they are applying through an organization. Field doesn't give these awards just directly to a person, but we're able to support their storytelling work, their projects that are rooted in journalism and that are rooted in serving the community through our funds. Another really unique thing that I'd like to talk about, Karen, I know you didn't ask about this, is that Field has found a way to also fund for-profit organizations. And the reason I want to highlight that and spotlight it is because for so many, particularly Black and Latin-owned media and storytelling organizations, they are not nonprofits. They are not set up to be nonprofits, and many of them don't want to be. They are for-profits, they're entrepreneurs, and they want to make sure that they're able to preserve that status in the community, because for BIPOC businesses, being a business, being an entrepreneur is so significant and is so important. And so what we found at Field is that if we really want to invest in news organizations that are serving the Black and Latin community in Chicago, and even the Korean American community in Chicago, well, then we have to adjust so that we are able to then give grants and give support and give that lift to them as well, so that they are then included into the as among the organizations and included in the cohort and the collective of organizations that we support. Because again, if we want to make sure that we are distributing the resources equitably, we can't force particularly legacy Black and Latin media to adjust to us. We have to figure out how we can adjust to them.
Excellent. Melissa, I thank you. And what you said, Melissa, I really, you've done some creative work as well to support NewsMatch and to support for-profit organizations. Lolly was just saying that. I really want to kind of like pull back the veil, like, because when the audience is talking to funders, you can say there are other examples out there of folks doing this. Melissa, would you speak about that, please? NewsMatch.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, similar to Lolly, I think, let me just say nonprofit media is so important in the ecosystem. I mean, it's really leading the field in the types of community service that we want to see. And we also know that there are some hyper-local community-based outlets that if they were to disappear, it would be a huge news desert over most parts of our state. And as a place-based funder for NewsMatch, I think we only had like 4 or 5 INN members, but we spun up this thing called News Colorado Needs, where we can provide micro grants to matching grants to community-based, hyper-local, locally owned, because we do want to kind of be real about who we can support as a philanthropic entity. But yeah, I mean, I think that has really, for us, opened up the conversation with so many more really important news sources, like Lolly mentioned. A lot of the ethnic media, especially, some serving the Black community, have a long legacy of, being for-profit models. They rely a lot on advertising and do a great job at that. And so yeah, we've done that. Last year, we supported 25 newsrooms at $5,000 each, so that we raised over $250,000 through that program, just on the matching grant alone, not even counting all the other funding that they raised during that time. But it's been a real nice farm team, I think, for approach. It's really helped some of those news outlets learn how to take on what we call a mission mindset, and so that they're really thinking more about how to engage their local constituents as partners with them in the journalism, rather than just consumers of news. And so it's been a great thing where INN members have been real leaders, and I'll talk more about that a little bit in the session tomorrow if you are interested.
Excellent. Rebecca Aguilar is asking about where there might be a database or a list of foundations that support journalism. I do want to mention too that there are organizations that there are funders that may support a topic like homelessness, a community concern like homelessness. And so you wouldn't necessarily think that they support journalism, but then they realize it certainly happened during the pandemic that journalism can get the word out about their programs. And so there may be support. Does anybody else want to comment?
Can I add to that too?
Yes,
I mean,
please.
I think that's a really important gateway and something for INN members to think about. If you can really practice making the case, especially if you want to expand, even if you're a general purpose newsroom, if you want to expand your coverage, I mean, this isn't necessarily rocket science, but if you want to expand your coverage into covering environmental issues, go to an environmental funder. You're going to find a lot of alignment there. So don't limit yourselves to people who have already funded that topic. Sometimes funders just need to hear the case being made, and they don't really know. I mean, they're like the general public. They don't really know how much the industry is changing and how much nonprofit news has become, a central figure and very needed moving forward. So I think the more INN members that are out there, just even getting in front of funders and making a case is helpful overall to the industry.
Yes, I'd like to echo Melissa because she's absolutely right. For example, we see the Walton Family Foundation that has been willing to invest in education reporting. And so although they don't fund journalism broadly, they're willing to invest in journalism that is steeped in education and changing the sort of narrative or addressing the narrative and the lack of education reporting. So I do think that it's important that you if you're seeking funding, that you think creatively about what type of funding you're seeking and where's the best avenues, and sometimes the less competitive avenues. One of the things that we're seeing at Field, again, we just serve Chicago and Chicagoland journalism and media organizations. This portfolio has only been around for nearly 3 years, and the number of applicants has tripled from when the portfolio first came online. And so there's a larger number of people who are competing for this small pot. And so I think Melissa is absolutely right about thinking about who on the outside of journalism funding is willing to invest in arts journalism, for example, or environmental reporting, educational reporting, the training ground for people who are going to serve as critics, the next generation of architecture critics. There are other foundations that you could reach out to and make the case for funding these positions.
And I'll just add on to that too. I mean, if we're coming up with creative pitches and things like that, I mean, I think another thing that funders realize, and it just is kind of intuitive, that there is a lot of media fragmentation now, and it's really difficult sometimes as funders to know, what's reach, who's your audience, and things like that. And so there's a real opportunity, I think, for collaborative projects. I think that you see it, INN spearheading this a lot. CoLab in our state is spearheading a lot of these. The Colorado Sun does it too. These big, higher profile reporting projects that can really take an issue and kind of elevate it above the kind of buzz of the chatter or whatever. And if you, are thinking about that, think about who your reporting partners might be and who are your other allied newsrooms, and not just newsrooms, but community organizations that you're going to kind of put together and really strengthen your own reporting and distribution. And those types of kind of, creative projects that are already underway that a lot of newsrooms are doing, a lot with like solutions journalism support and things like that. Those are really compelling to funders. Those kind of like, they get that, especially new funders, people that aren't really, funding it as heavily as like Lolly and I and Karen.
So we have just a few minutes left. So short answer. So look, I would love for you both just to be really frank about what mistakes applicants make. And look, a mistake sometimes is what you don't know. So what don't they know? Lolly.
Thank you, Karen. A couple things, at least for me, as I'm looking. One is writing in the proposal or in your pitch about what you're going to do rather than demonstrating how you're already doing that work. Because Field has a limited pool and a small pool of resources, we want to be really discerning about ensuring that we empower organizations that are already serving communities, that are already delivering the news. And so writing a proposal about how essentially, if you get some funding, you'll then serve BIPOC communities, or you'll then start providing bilingual news. Just it doesn't demonstrate the work that you're already doing to get there. So that, so that's one of the big things that I kind of see. The other thing is that knowing the foundation that you're applying to and what their interests are and their funding interests in their own funding strategy. So again, as I've repeated over and over again for Field, we're really, really invested in equity and social justice. So if you come to us with a proposal that is not inclusive, that continues to serve the fragmentation and the segregation of the city, it's difficult for us to justify investing in that, right? If your staff and your board demographics are not reflective of the vibrant diversity of our city, it's very difficult for us to build a case to support that. So again, just knowing the priorities of the organization before you make that pitch.
Melissa, what don't folks know, or what is a mistake that people make?
I don't know. That's a hard one because we're always trying to, listen and coach even when we do get the mistakes. So I would encourage people to reach out and, make those mistakes. But also, I think just to echo what Lali's saying, I think more and more philanthropy is really looking for that. We're going to, I think, just generally as a field, be really asking for, how are you serving your community? How do you look like your community? What is your leadership? And is it, are you authentically really interested in serving your community differently, or just kind of continuing business as usual, especially as, kind of more legacy institutions are kind of dabbling into the, kind of philanthropic adjacent funding space. I think we're really looking for newsrooms that are committed to creating a new ecosystem for local news and being a part of a mission aligned vision for serving communities. And so I think that sounds kind of broad, but I would agree with Lally, like read the website, read our writings. We have a lot of thought pieces on our website about what we're into and things like that. So I think that's probably, if I had to say one very quick thing about the mistakes, is just not doing your research, and that doesn't make us want to spend a ton of time with you at that point, if that's clear.
Thank you. I really appreciate your honesty. You've both been very frank. I want you to know too that philanthropy does make its own mistakes, and we're also self-critiquing, and we hear you. We see your tweets. Thanks to everybody for listening. I just wanted to mention about growing the philanthropic pie, just specifically around NewsMatch. That was something that, the famous story, Jennifer Preston, the VP at the time, and Sue Cross, that kind of was born in a weekend. I think it was hatched on a Friday and went to board on a Monday, which never, ever, ever happens. And, that was one funder. And today, I think it was like 19. So it has grown in 5 years, the number of funders really supporting NewsMatch. So growing the philanthropic pie does happen. There are more news organizations to support than back then, but so thank you so much.